Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. As someone interested in weird things, and as someone who has been so since I was a lad, it's inevitable that I've come across and been fascinated by issues in parapsychology and the paranormal. But for the most part, I have avoided really studying these things in great depth until recently, partly because there were many other things to look at that also intrigued me, and also because I realized pretty early on that to fully grapple with these questions, I had to learn some stuff I wasn't necessarily ready to learn, particularly things about statistics. Because if you dig down into a lot of the nitty-gritty arguments between parapsychology researchers coming up with positive effects and their invariable hordes of snarky, skeptical attackers, a lot of the arguments get down to statistical ones. So I thought, well, I'll get around to this one of these days. And a few years ago, actually a number of years ago now, I read George Hansen's Trickster and the Paranormal, really one of my favorite books. And we've had George on the show, and he has a particular take on the trickiness of paranormal research as a science, as an experimental science, as a theoretical science, and the way in which, and his argument is that there's something inherent in these phenomena that make them difficult to or elusive in terms of our normal ways as Western more or less materialist scientific people using research techniques and the scientific method to capture. So I was very intrigued by that. But more recently, I have gotten fascinated by the topic, not because I have a particular belief about telepathy or clairvoyance or precognition. I've heard lots of anecdotes. I've had peculiar experiences in my own life that if I were to turn into a theoretical model of the universe, definitely would contradict your typical materialist skeptic's view of how the cosmos works. But I'm not so interested in asserting whether or not I personally believe this or don't believe that. What's gotten me really interested again is looking at the way that skepticism is sort of militantly enforced through our society. So I'm kind of actually more interested in looking at parapsychology not just to find out what the latest evidence is, because any evidence you have is immediately attacked by this sort of varied forces of skepticism. And that was the thing that really became interesting to me, watching it. And I'm very happy. I've been wanting to get him on the show for a long time. Very happy today we'll be talking with Dean Radin, who's I think his first name is appropriate. I would consider him the Dean of American Parapsychologists in some ways, and a very good and articulate popular presenter, as well as someone who's been working in the field for a very long time. And there was one comment when I finally got to meet Dean a number of years ago. Someone asked him what he had learned. What is it that he learned the most after putting in so many long, hard years, both in studying the phenomena and then defending it? And he answered, you might think, I've learned that, the cosmos is a unified field of consciousness, or I've learned that, of all the effects, precognition is the most robust. But instead he said what he learned the most after all these years was the sociology of science. And since science continues to be the major determinant of our sense of what reality is, and by that it doesn't just mean what the things out there are, but who we are, what we're capable of doing, what the world is capable of being, it's very important to pay attention to how science works. And if you just look at science on the level of the ideas, the concepts, or even the much vaunted scientific method, you miss something. And what you miss is the sociology of science, how science, too, is a human practice. It relies on the same things that all the other more squirrely human practices like arts or humanities or politics or the law rely on. And it is buffeted about by very similar forces. Yes, there's something different about science. I think it's always important to emphasize that. But at the same time, there are sociological effects that are incredibly powerful, incredibly real, and have to be taken into account as we wrestle with the claims that some scientists put forward about what we can or cannot think about and what the limits are of nature and of human consciousness. So that's kind of some of the issues that have been on my mind. And then I discovered that Dean's most recent book, I was familiar with his earlier books, The Conscious Universe and Entangled Minds, but last year he came out with a book called Supernormal: Science, Yoga, and the Evidence for Extraordinary Psychic Abilities. And this was great because it resonated with other conversations we've had on Expanding Mind, particularly with Professor Jeffrey Kripal, who I've worked with at Rice University, getting my religious studies degree. And this sort of idea of kind of thinking about supernormal powers as an interesting and powerful bridge between contemporary popular culture, superhero movies, the idea of, kind of extra normal human capacities, and very old religious ideas, very old ideas in mystical literature and magical literature of these kind of supernormal capacities, and how this sort of stream of religious and even popular culture, comic book ideas resonate with and sort of respond to much more hard-edged studies in various paranormal phenomena. So I was very excited to see that particular bell being struck as well. So with no further ado, Maja will not be joining us today. I'd like to invite our guest, Dean, onto Expanding Mind. Dean, thanks so much for joining us on the show.
I'm glad to be here.
That's great. I'd love to start out talking about your connection with India and yoga and how that kind of emerged. Your last book was on Deepak Chopra's books publishing imprint through Crown. So I gather that at some point in the recent years, your studies or your interests brought you more fully into a kind of conversation with India and Indian spirituality.
Well, I guess they can trace it all the way back to my childhood, where my mother was doing yoga probably now 50 years ago. And as a child, of course, you don't know that what your parents are doing is strange or not strange. I just figured that's something that people do. And as a result, we had a number of books around that were titles that were popularization of yoga about 50 years ago, but also a couple of the books by the great stories of the Eastern masters. And of course, I was reading at the time, I'm talking about maybe 10 or 11 years old, I was reading stories of mythology and fairy tales and science fiction and all kinds of things like that, like kids read. And I couldn't distinguish between the supposed true stories of the mystic masters of the East versus my comic books. They sounded the same. And I remember talking to my parents about this, and they said, well, maybe it's real, maybe it's not real. But I never forgot the difference, which was we knew about fantasy. We knew that a fairy tale was, in fact, fantasy. But these other books claimed to be real. So that may have been my first inkling that maybe there was something interesting going on.
I can't help just to ask a little bit more about your mom there. Was she practicing yoga largely as a sort of physical calisthenic practice, or was she also interested in meditation and control of the mind and such?
Mostly as a physical practice. When yoga came to the West from the East, almost all of its traditional notion about development of the mind was stripped away. And so there you probably could have found some places in a few large cities that, in this case, CITIES instead of the yoga cities, SIDDHI. You could have found some big cities like New York City where maybe there was classical yoga being taught, but probably not too many. So it was a physical.
Had Stephanie Simon on the show, and she did a very interesting history on yoga in America. And what she showed, which really changed my view of it in an interesting way, is that there's really almost a sine wave of yoga in the West in terms of the degree of spirituality. That very early on there was a great deal of spirituality, and then it sort of becomes very calisthenic, and then there's another blip of more metaphysics, and then it goes into calisthenics. And even in our more recent memory, we have the explosion in the. So your mother's at a period before the counterculture, more calisthenic. Then in the in the 60s, and late 60s and 70s, lots of metaphysics. But in the 80s, we also have Jane Fonda and all the the videos
right.
and all that. So it's a very interesting place in American culture where both sides of the equation are sort of fighting to kind of come together in an interesting way, which in a sense is probably what your project is about, less about the physical aspects of yoga, but about aspects of yoga that are described in what's widely embraced as the sort of supreme scripture of yoga, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which you address directly in your book. And tell me a little bit about that particular book as a story of supernormal powers that kind of clearly inspired your thinking as
right. So the interesting thing about the fads and fashions that you had mentioned is that there's a very tight correlation between interest in matters metaphysical and the rise and fall, the sine wave, of interest in psi, or in psychic research. They're more or less in lockstep, these two trends. And so the reason why I was interested in particular into the Yoga Sutras is because it's one of the first written forms of an ancient method, which used to only be through oral transmission. And the third book of the Yoga Sutras is all about what today we would probably call psychic phenomena. And it's more than simply describing the phenomena. It's a set of prescriptions on how to develop them. So that seems like a good place to start to evaluate whether or not what Patanjali was saying was likely to be true or likely to be fantasy. And so the whole point of my book, Supernormal, is addressing that from a scientific perspective and basically reaching the conclusion that Patanjali was not spinning fairy tales as far as we can tell.
Yeah, it's fascinating too how, and I wonder. I know you've spent time in India, and obviously you've met both psychic researchers and yogis and other people. How it seems to me, and I don't know contemporary Indian culture particularly well, but it seems to me that there has always been, both in the traditional period and in more modern times, just in general a wider acceptance. Of course, these things are there. There are these powers. Gurus get them, et cetera, and as opposed to the much more vexed and contentious discussion of these things in the West. I don't know if that's changed with modernization and, of course, in India's own very powerful scientific tradition and their own turn towards Western ways of thinking. But it does seem that there's something very that this question of powers, of supernormal powers, is a very deep and very powerful one in Indian religion and experience for all time.
And very different from the West. Very, very different, even among scientists. So to give an example, one of the places that I spoke at in India was the University of Allahabad. and in its Center for Excellence for Neuroscience, Cognitive Neuroscience. And so the work that they're doing, most of the professors are Western trained, so you could go to almost any university doing cognitive neuroscience in the West and be transplanted into this place in Allahabad, and you wouldn't know the difference. But a major difference is that, for one thing, I was invited to give a talk about psychic phenomena, which doesn't happen in the West. And another is that the questions and the interest of the faculty, students, you always know are going to be interested, but the faculty is always a question. Are they willing to be public about their interests? And that this is where the sociological issue comes into play. In India, everyone pretty much takes for granted that some of these stories are true. They don't know in any detail about any specific story, but that the idea that some people have special abilities is not really a serious question. So after I gave my talk on telepathy for this group of faculty and students in a department of cognitive neuroscience with lots of interesting questions, I had dinner with the chair of the department, and I asked him if he thought that they may want to do some experiments on telepathy. And he has statues of Ganesha on his desk. You know, he's into the whole thing. He's part of the Indian culture. And his immediate response was surprising to me. He said no. And I said, well, given that it's not considered such a big deal here, there's no taboo against it, why not? And the answer is that, at least within the way that cognitive neuroscience is defined in a mainstream sense, there's no need for telepathy. It's not about telepathy. It's like that's a different discipline. It's not the discipline that we're doing, so it doesn't make sense for us to study it. And at first, I was just puzzled at that response. How could you be so interested in something having to do with the mind in some way, which is a big puzzle, and yet at the same time not want to study it? And then after I thought about it a while, I realized, well, it makes sense within an academic context that you carve up the world into certain well-understood consensus notions about the way things are, and that's what you study.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you're interested in other things, it would be almost like you're a cognitive neuroscience scientist, that's what you do, and you're also fascinated by the internal combustion engine. Well, you could be fascinated by it and even come up with something new about that, but you would never publish it in cognitive neuroscience because it's not part of the field.
Right.
So that was the thing that was surprising. So if you take exactly the same experience in the West, you might have faculty present. You certainly will have students present, but they won't ask any questions, and they will adopt frozen faces of a kind of somewhere between amusement and scowling, because they know that how they are perceived as paying attention to this topic is important for the social context. So I've been in situations where I'd give a talk, students ask a lot of questions, everyone then goes away, and then only afterwards I start getting emails from the faculty who are desperate to tell me their psychic stories, provided that I promise that I'm not going to reveal who they are. And it's both funny and perplexing and frustrating at the same time.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. I don't want to, I've ranted recently on the show about some of these issues around skepticism and this division between a public admission and sort of a private world of storytelling. So I don't want to spend the whole time doing it, but it comes up a lot. I mean, it's so similar, as you know, to reports that Jeff Kripal will make, because here he is also an outlier in his field that's very, very materialistic, although in a different way, not so much about the scientific idea of materialism, but more of historical materialism, but basically very uninterested in ideas of religious experience as being something powerful or certainly these kinds of mystical powers. And he reports the same thing. He'll go and he'll give a talk. There's sort of discomfort around among many of the faculty. Students are sort of polite, not much is said. And then later he gets all these private communications, and he's got this huge file of hundreds and hundreds of stories that people have given him in this field or around this field that very few would even acknowledge publicly. So there's so many things that are going on here. But I'd actually like to start with a kind of more personal question, since obviously you've spent a significant portion of your career dealing with this frustrating, fascinating, undoubtedly sometimes incredibly enervating, set of resistances, and it's important work that you keep, trying to open up the conversation, and that's probably turned out to be a much larger percentage of your career than you would have liked to have spent. You probably would have liked to spend more time doing studies and organizing conferences and putting things forward that way. So, what in your own personality, your own experience, your own convictions has enabled you to keep pounding on that door for so long, and to keep an even tone, because you have a very even tone in your writing and in your presentations. It's very admirable because it's a very contentious space, and a lot of the people you're arguing against do not have such good control over their tone. There's that smirking, snarky, biting, mocking kind of cruelty amongst so much of the skeptical brigade, which itself is sort of an interesting thing. So I'd like to hear kind of almost a more personal story of how this has been like for you fighting this battle that's just ongoing.
I think if at some level I didn't enjoy the battle, I wouldn't be doing this. It requires a certain degree of enjoyment about being an iconoclast. And I don't think I set out that way, but I think I discovered along the way that I don't really care that much about what other people think. So that's like number one. Number two is I get bored very quickly with things that other people are doing or already have done. I'm just not interested in that. And third, I come from a family that was always very interested in social justice. And so I think rather than starting unions and marching for civil rights and those sorts of things that members of my family did, I'm kind of doing a similar kind of tact, but in a scientific realm. And so my interest is partially about nature of consciousness and our capacities and all that, which is interesting. But it's actually also, and increasingly more, a matter of what amounts to teaching tolerance to scientists. Because from a media perspective, and at least the mainstream media perspective, and the way our textbooks write about the way science is done, it has a certain gloss of supreme rationality and everyone striving to work together to improve knowledge and so forth. And of course, that's not the way it works. And students are not taught this. So I'd like to, the reason why I give interviews and talks and write books and so on is partially not so much to reach people my age, because it's already too late. I'm more interested in talking to people who are 20 plus or minus a couple of years, because they haven't congealed yet into the kinds of adults that make it difficult for science to actually advance. So those are the ones that I'm more interested in reaching in many ways. If in a different context, a different culture, I would be out there doing some kind of work on social justice, probably.
Fascinating. So, and then how do things look now? I mean, how do they look in terms of more recently, either your impressions of the younger people that you're meeting, or your own capacities to create more tolerance, or at least try to open up the question to sort of diminish some of that instantaneous snark. What's your sense of how things are changing now?
Well, we are always in cultural currents, and if you happen to be riding the surf and the current is going in your direction, things look real good. And if you happen to be going against the current, it's much more difficult. And I've been doing this long enough, so I've been in both. And so I would say now that in terms of surfing on the current, that the current is beginning to go in the direction where things become much, much easier. And one of the ways that I see that is what journals are willing to accept papers on these topics, and what mainstream colleagues are willing to be more tentatively public about their actual interests. And so there are more and more examples, very slow, but more examples of that happening. And that, to me, is a sign that the current is pointing at what I would consider to be a good direction.
Yeah, that would seem to be from where I sit, something similar. I think it's not unrelated to, let's say, the return of mainstream scientific interest in psychedelics and people willing to be talking about psychedelics. And in some ways, I think it does have to do with the increased attention that I think will keep going throughout our century on the brain and the nervous system, but ultimately this question of consciousness. That if you're really devoted to a very a materialist or reductionist account of consciousness in relationship to the brain, you clearly have to really go out there and really account for these things. If you're being honest, these things that just keep coming up in people's stories, in people's experiences. They just keep coming up across cultures, different socioeconomic layers, different levels of education, different predilections for religion or atheism or whatever. It just keeps coming up. So you got to account for it. So it seems like there's that shift today. And I think probably yoga has something to do with that too, the popularity of yoga, the popularity of mindfulness and other meditation techniques, and that kind of brings us around again to your more recent interest in yoga. So I thought maybe you could just give us a little sense of what the cities, not the cities where we live, but the cities that we might experience, the cities that are described in Patanjali, and how they, how neatly they map onto some of the topics that you look at in terms of psi research.
Okay. So the Yoga Sutras, book number 3, Vibhuti Pata, it's called, which roughly, Vibhuti is a kind of an ash that's used in religious ceremonies to indicate that you've achieved a certain degree of expertise. You've burned through your karma, so to speak. And Pada means book. So it's the book about accomplishments. And these particular accomplishments are the result of disciplined meditative practice. In fact, all of classical yoga is really about meditation. It has very little to do with physical things. The physical part of it is only in support of a better ability to meditate. So if you can achieve a disciplined level of meditation and you do a practice called sanyama, you can develop certain special abilities. So the siddhis is a Sanskrit word which roughly means attainment or perfection or something, perfected attainment. And the perfection means that if you could go into a state of samadhi, which is kind of a mystical union, and hold a thought or an intention while in that state, then you will achieve certain things. So as an example, the very first siddhi that is mentioned in the Yoga Sutras is the ability to perceive the past, present, and future all at the same time. So perceiving the past we would think of as memory, perceiving the present is no big deal. Perceiving the future, well, that's a little more surprising, and we might call it precognition. So how do you do this? Well, first you obtain a mystical state, and then in the mystical state you contemplate the notion of causality itself. And in the process of doing that, you begin to recognize that the future, past, and present actually are linked. And what's very interesting about that notion is that some of the rising reinterpretations of quantum mechanics are almost exactly rephrasing of what Patanjali wrote about a couple thousand years ago, namely that a retrocausal phenomena may be a better explanation for quantum effects than other strange explanations.
Well, I'm so glad you brought this up, because my favorite bit in the book, the stuff that I wasn't as familiar with in terms of the more recent psi experiments, were the ones that had to do with retro causality. So I think it's perhaps not accidental that you brought that up as your supreme example. So I look forward to asking about that, but we've got to take a break here right now, and you're listening to Expanding Mind on the Progressive Radio Network, and we'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, and today we're speaking with Dean Radin, a long-time student and studier of things parapsychological. And just before the break, we were talking about that one of the siddhis, or sort of paranormal magical powers that are described in the Yoga Sutras and are, of course, are found in many of the tales of Mahasiddhas and other wonder workers in the East and sometimes in the West as well, is the ability to predict or have some presentiment of the future. And I had mentioned that this opened up some of the most interesting, more recent studies that you talk about in your book, Supernormal, which have to do with this, with retrocausality. Can you just give us a little taste of the studies, particularly the ones done by Darlie Bem, that seemed very interesting in terms of their experimental design, very simple, and some of the rather robust apparent effects?
Well, his name is Darrell, not Darlie. Sometimes there's a dyslexic transformation that happens with his first name, but it is Darrell.
Thank you.
There's two sides I can talk about here, and both point back to what's written in the Yoga Sutras. So the Yoga Sutras say you could simultaneously perceive the past, present, and future, implying a link among those three, that if you contemplate it, that's how you gain both precognition and retrocognition. It's through mystical union with that notion. So on the physics side, there's a famous physicist named Yakir Arnov, who a couple of years ago developed a method called weak measurement, and more importantly, a interpretation of quantum mechanics which basically says that our understanding of time and causality are not completely correct. And if we thought about time, in particular causality, as both having forward and backward going components, then all of the strangeness of quantum mechanics begins to make a lot of sense. So Discover magazine a few years ago had a featured article on him, and one of the things it says in there is that Aronov was one of the first to take seriously the idea that if you want to understand what's happening at any point in time, it's not just the past that's relevant, it's also the future. So this is in a science magazine today, and it's a popularization of the methods that Aronov and others are putting together, and that is almost a translation in modern physics terms of what Patanjali was saying, that the present depends on both the future and the past. And so, well, that's interesting. And more importantly, it gives rise to different kinds of experiments. If the present actually does depend on the future, then you can do an experiment, as Darrell has done and as I have done and a number of colleagues, where you look at some measurement, either a physiological measurement or a behavioral measurement right now, but you then have the person do something in the future. In the case of Darrell, he has them look at a picture or make a decision in the future. And then you can see whether the decision in the future or looking at a picture in the future affects your behavior or your physiology in the present. And if that is true, then it shows that your present time actually is dependent on the future, as both Aronov says and as Patanjali said. So those experiments have been done and repeated many, many times, and it turns out that is true, that the present is, to some degree, dependent on what happens later. So this is an interesting correspondence between, and we always have to be careful, by the way, to not shoehorn a little bit too much, but from my understanding of what Patanjali wrote, my understanding of what's happening now both experimentally and in theoretical physics, it looks very much to me like we constantly rediscover what the ancients understood. We discover in a way that we hope is a little bit more comprehensive and maybe more sophisticated in terms of our understanding of why it works. But if somebody was writing about more or less the same idea a couple thousand years ago, and that was already part of a long oral tradition, then I pay attention to that. I think it's quite interesting.
Now, has there been a general kind of a shift in more recent years in terms of parapsychological studies towards these questions of time and retrocausality? Is that sort of a newer focus, or has that been persistent throughout the 20th century?
No, I wouldn't say there's a new thrust, except perhaps because Darrell Bem is a prominent psychologist and was able to publish his studies in a very prominent journal, it probably attracted more attention than some of the other experiments that have been done. And so there's probably, in historical terms, a flurry of interest in retrocausation now. I think maybe partially because of what I started to do with a presentiment experiment. And then Darrell took that and simplified it and used his experience and his clever design to promote it very widely. And so I'm not sure I would say it's a renaissance for precognition, right. But I'm sure if we look historically at the number of studies that have been done, that in the past 5 years or so, there would be a blip, certainly a blip in precognition
here's another question on these studies, since they were done by a very prominent psychologist and they appeared in a mainstream publication. And there was a lot of interest around them, and this is a recent event. We can sort of look at this as an example of how things are either shifting or not shifting in terms of the reception and the kinds of responses given by skeptics or more open-minded psychologists, for that matter. So can you reflect a little bit on what happened to him, what kind of response the journal got, how it affected his career, or just because it seems like a more significant, more recent event, it would be just interesting to hear what the upshot was in terms of the larger discussion.
Right. So Darrell is retired, and so in terms of his future career, it doesn't matter too much. In terms of what happened, this is a great exercise in sociology of science, because before the paper was even published, it was circulated among a bunch of people, and it was in print, but not yet actually hit the press yet. The New York Times came out with an editorial warning everybody to be outraged, prepare to be outraged, because this very high-impact journal is going to publish something on precognition, which we all know is nonsense, and so everyone should be prepared for silliness. And immediately, again, even before the paper was actually even printed, there were people saying, well, there's something wrong with science, and our journals are not working so good, and how could anybody even dare to publish such a thing? I mean, just astonishing, the kind of responses.
The part that I got, just to clarify, because it is really astonishing, is that it wasn't the usual attack of like, clearly there's a flaw in the experiment, clearly there's something wrong with the interpretation of the statistics. What it was is that if this is able to be shown as a robust response, and if it was able to be therefore published in a respectable journal, therefore there's something wrong with the whole system. That's the only way we can explain it, is to say there's something wrong in the system of science that could possibly allow such a egregiously false thing to be represented as scientific research. I mean, it really is quite extraordinary moment.
Yeah, and this is just one example of many, many examples that you could find historically, that there's kind of a collective reaction, like an allergic reaction. Like some antibody has entered the system which is going to seriously damage it. And so people respond not rationally at all. They respond very much like the whole system is gearing up to get rid of this offending antibody.
Yeah.
And so this is the sociology of science at its best and its worst at the same time. It's easiest to see that science is only partially rational. And if you happen to be at the center of it, it's not so pleasant. So, of course, the more prominent you are, the more people will pay attention to it. So Darryl got a lot of interest and a lot of flack at the same time. But he knew that this would happen, so it wasn't a surprise. I'm not as prominent as Darryl. And so I'm in a more fortunate situation in that if I publish something, most of the time it's just ignored. People don't care one way or the other. And that suits me fine, because the kind of work that I'm doing is I'm putting it into the scientific archives as a promissory note for future researchers. Just like I go back and I look at the things that have been written 100 years ago, all those people are dead. But why did they write what they did? Well, they thought they had something interesting to say, and now we could look back on it and say, oh, this person was really onto something interesting. And so I just take the long view, and that's one of the reasons why I don't like certain criticisms and certain individuals who are very happy to be nasty, but it doesn't affect me that much.
It's funny. It's almost a retrocausal ethics. I mean, you're almost producing data or publishing with a mind towards, you're already in that future moment when there's a retrospective look, going, hey, yeah, this guy was doing good stuff. We can use this. It's very interesting. It's very different than the kind of hustle and quest for some kind of recognition in the moment that drives, unfortunately overdrives. So much of our culture. But I wanted to ask you, having witnessed I love the idea of an allergic response, because it's sort of how it feels like. It's like this kind of collect. What is at the root of it? Is it fear? Is it a kind of a sort of twisted form of a certain ethical stance? Sometimes it seems like that a lot of skeptics feel like it's just them and their friends who are standing against an incoming wave of supernaturalism that's going to take us back to the Middle Ages or something, or is it almost a kind of conspiracy, not in the sense of a conspiracy theory in a dark, like kind of fantastical way, but just that there's very explicit, very real, formal networks of individuals and institutions who, for whatever reason, are completely devoted to skepticism with a capital S. What's going on with the intensity of that allergic response?
Well, intensity means that there's an emotional base. And one way of thinking of where the emotion comes from is that for academics in particular, but even non-academics, we don't take ideas as simply as ideas. Nobody does. We identify with ideas. I mean, there are people who will strap on a bomb and kill themselves for an idea and kill others as well. So this is not a minor issue about whether I'm going to believe this or that. It is who you are. It becomes your identity. So academics are particularly prone to this because the whole academic effort, whether it's in science or in the humanities, you become your idea. If somebody attacks your idea, they are literally, or at least it feels like it, they are attacking you. And so the emotion comes from somebody's attacking me. I better save myself. If you conflate that, then it's not just me, it's not just my idea, but it's like the idea of society. Everyone should have this idea, because obviously if I have it, it must be a good idea. So everyone should have this idea. And so they're attacking my idea. They're attacking everyone. So it's I'm saving everybody by having a reaction to this. So one of the types of people who very strongly identify with ideas is when you have a deep-seated need to do that, to identify with it. And this goes beyond simply holding ideas like I'm a Democrat or a Republican, or I'm religious of this flavor or that flavor. Those are part of you as well, which helps explain the energy behind it. But in the case of protecting everyone from issues having to do with psychic and mystical experience in particular, I think that comes out of early childhood, particularly people who are brought up in a fundamentalist religion. They buy it completely as children because they don't know any better. They become teenagers, they start questioning it, and many of them eventually realize that they've been lied to for years by people they trusted. or telling them stories that are not true. Those people go through such mental anguish that something goes click in their head, and anybody who attempts to promote something which they would perceive as being metaphysical, mystical, psychic, anything like that, that those people are just as bad as the people who are telling them the miracles of the so-called religious figures. And they strike out with anger. And not surprisingly, because they have the same anger that they had for the people who were trying to sell them stuff which they consider to be hogwash as children.
Yeah, that's very perceptive, and I mean I think it's interesting. It's even reflected in one of the arguments against parapsychology that you come up with a lot is that they say, even if you do a meta-analysis where you're looking at a wide variety of studies that are all looking at more or less the same thing, and you show these statistical, even if the statistics are mathematically solid, you have to take into account fraud. There's always the hoaxer, the con man, the one who's manipulating, the one who's tricking. Now, of course, these people are real. Of course, this is part of parapsychology, just as it's been part of spiritualism and mysticism and gurus in India. I mean, the whole thing. There are tricksters and magicians and con men in the story, no question. But what's interesting about it is that possibility and the fear and the anger and the resentment that are bound up with that possibility are actually a core part of the argument. It's not just an emotionally motivating thing. It's actually real. It's like we can't trust people that much. You can't trust people at all. Even these apparently reputable scientists, even these apparently naive undergraduates who are their students, you can't trust it. You have to always be sniffing out the con man, the liar, the manipulator. And it's part of what science should do. I mean, it's a good thing to remember. It's a good thing in religion. It's a good thing. It's part of the story, but it's not the whole story. And that's what you get from so many skeptics, both in terms of religion and in terms of parapsychology, is just this vision of just con men everywhere, except them.
Well, it's true that if you look at critiques of the books that I've written, you can tell immediately where somebody's coming from by what they choose to complain about. And so the lifelong skeptics will say, no, my books are heavily biased because it doesn't mention the cases of fraud. Now, if I were speaking to the skeptic, I would say, well, can you tell me some of the cases of fraud that you have in mind? And if they're actually know anything, they might say something, well, we know that mediums are oftentimes found to be fraud. And I would say, yes, in the 1800s. And the Fox sisters who started all spiritualism, they said that they were fraud. And I'd say, yeah, that's true. But then later in life, they recanted. And anyway, that was 100 years ago. I want to know among scientists, how many fraudulent scientists have been unmasked within this realm? Now, if they know the history, they'll be able to name one or two, because there are only one or two. And so you now compare it against, well, what about fraud in other areas of science? There are plenty of people who have been captured as fraudulent. So compare that against science in this realm. How does it compare? It turns out that in this realm, it's much, much better. Many more honest people involved, because you don't have anything to gain in this realm. If you're trying to sell something, you might, but the scientists who are doing this work get nothing. All they do is basically get nonsense from people. So, and given an opportunity to respond to, we need to be careful about the frauds, I say absolutely. We need to be as skeptical as we possibly can, but not crazy skeptical. And you also need to know what you're talking about. So in terms of fraudulent science driving the databases that we deal with, that's a fiction.
Yeah.
There is no fraud. I mean,
and that's another point that
there are a couple
of
cases that we know are probably fraudulent. One or two have been proven, but we're talking about a handful out of literally thousands and thousands of studies.
And then isn't that also part of the argument behind meta-analysis, is that some of these are, or for whatever reason, there's noise in there, and that partly by taking these large baskets of studies and averaging them in sophisticated statistical ways, that you help prevent the mistakes that might come from putting too much emphasis on any particular study, which might be flawed for any number of reasons.
Well, the complaints about meta-analysis are a catch-22. Because on the one hand, you have someone like Daryl Bem saying, look, I did these experiments, and people immediately say, yeah, well, maybe it won't be repeatable, and then it's not really science. So that automatically means you have to allow for some kind of measurement of repeatability. Well, that's what meta-analysis is. It's about looking at whether an effect has been repeated. But then you present the meta-analysis showing that repeatability has been achieved, and now people don't like it anymore, because now it's suddenly not about repeatability. Rather, it's about a single experiment that's going to change the world, and in which I say then no single experiment has ever changed the world, with the one possibility being the Higgs boson, but that costs $10 billion. And so they can't repeat it because they don't have enough money.
I'm not sure. I don't understand. What is the criticism that people have of meta-analysis? It's that it's just a statistical fact. We need to have a very clear, absolutely obvious single study. Is that what they're saying?
Yes. Yeah, they're saying these are generally said by people who don't understand statistics or meta-analysis, who may not realize that meta-analysis is a massive portion of the medical and behavioral sciences these days. It's absolutely necessary in order to figure out what does a batch of data tell us. And the methods that are used now, of course, people have long known that you can't create something out of nothing with statistics. You have to have something there to begin with. And so the methods that are used today are very sophisticated, including Bayesian techniques now in meta-analysis that take into account biases of the analysts. And the upshot of it is that this is a statistical technique which is very well accepted in many areas of science, and the same methods are being used here. And so discomfort with the idea of combining the studies is, from my perspective, since I do know how it works, it's due to either misunderstanding or not understanding at all anything about the way that the actual method is applied.
Yeah, I was very happy to see you address some of the Bayesian analysis stuff, because I've read about it in other contexts, cognitive science and behavioral economics and things like that. And it was really interesting to see how with that frame too, some of the issues that come up. But this leads me to a sort of a larger question. Earlier I had mentioned George Hansen, and Jeffrey Kripal has also put forward some version of this, which is that the idea that a lot of these effects that we're looking at, telepathy, clairvoyance, telekinesis, a number of these things, it might be the case that there's something inherent to the phenomena that makes them sort of fundamentally difficult to translate into the scientific framework, whether from sociological reasons or because of the nature of the phenomenon itself. For example, the idea that you're really only going to see robust examples of it in situations that are impossible to replicate and elude the laboratory. Your work, you continue to remain devoted to the idea of that these things can be shown with experimental science within the existing framework of how science is done. There's nothing wrong with in principle with the way that science is already done. Have you wrestled with that issue over the years? Have you always been very clear about the need and the power of doing it within existing experimental protocols?
I'm very happy to use other protocols that may not be considered mainstream within science today, but coming up with such protocols is not trivial at all. It's tempting, for example, to say, well, let's forget about quantitative methods and we'll just use qualitative methods. And that is an approach that some people are interested in, but it doesn't interest me because have we actually exhausted every possible experiment using what might be considered to be more or less standard quantitative methods used within science? And the answer is no. We have nowhere near exhausted what can be done with existing methods. When we look at advancements in other disciplines, other scientific disciplines, we have just barely scratched the surface of what is possible. And one of the reasons why I haven't given up with standard science at all is because I know a little bit about methods used in other fields, and I recognize that many of them actually could be very useful for studying these kinds of phenomena. So is it the case that there's something peculiar about consciousness that resists being studied? Absolutely. We immediately run into a recursion problem. That is, we're the very thing that's trying to understand itself, and that automatically presents problems. But very similar problems show up in other fields. The whole area of complexity theory and dynamic systems theory is all about how do you study recursive and complex networks. And very little of that has been applied to the kinds of phenomena that we deal with. So I'm still, I wouldn't say traditionalist in terms of what my interests are, but in terms of what I think could be applied that would be considered perfectly normal techniques in other disciplines, absolutely. We have way more to go until we give up.
Well, that's a wonderful and exciting note to end the conversation on. Dean Radin, thanks so much for joining me on Expanding Mind.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
Great. And that was Dean Radin. And please take a look at his books. They're really fascinating. They're very well written, very persuasive, and even-handed. So Supernormal being the most recent one. Thanks very much for listening. And remember, keep your minds open.